Welcome back to Tom's World Skill Model Series. In this installment, we complete the painting and weathering of our Meng Whippet medium tank. If you enjoy programming on scale modeling, then show your support by subscribing to this channel. Leave us a comment, like, dislike, or share the video with friends. Clicking the notification bell gives you alerts when we post new content, or visit the channel Tom's World for a friendly visit for a complete list of all our videos. In our build episode, we found a beautifully cast kit that was not without its challenges. The part count was fairly high, and the faceted superstructure build-up, while on the whole tight fitting, required some filling. As we'll see in this episode, the build was not without its late-game drama, so stay with us as we delve into the painting and weathering in what turned out to be a fascinating and skills-testing project. In our build episode, we got most of our Whippet parts ready for paint and weathering. The 303 Hotchkiss guns look superb, but they have solid barrels, and we hollowed one of the barrels out in our prior episode. We still had 3 to go, so let's repeat the process. We start by sanding the ends to remove any parting burr. Then we gently press and rotate the pointy end of a new number 11 X-Acto blade at dead center of the barrel. This creates a shallow pilot hole so our drill bit doesn't drift when we apply pressure to it. We were working with our smallest bit, the number 61. It's so tiny that my pin vise couldn't clamp it. Some masking tape was wrapped around the shaft to act as a shim so it fit firmly in the pin vise. Then we gently drill shallow holes in the rest of our machine guns. Despite being careful when building up our faceted superstructure, inevitably we ended up with some gaps that needed filling. For this project, we'll use a liquid filler to hide the gaps. Mr. Hobby makes these products, and we'll use the Mr. Surfacer 500. It's a fairly thick lacquer-based product that we can apply with a brush. We don't need to be overly tidy, perfect for on-camera shaky hands. We want to get the filler into the gaps as best we can. Then with a cotton swab dipped in lacquer thinner, we clean up the excess. The filler will settle and shrink a bit, so we may have to repeat the process 2 to 3 times. And here are the filled areas before painting. We don't have to worry about perfectly filling the gaps, we just don't want any obvious holes. If we look carefully at the plating on a real Whippet, we can see that the plate edges aren't chamfered, so they don't meet up perfectly. Rather, we see butt joints, and a very shallow but distinct separating channel is clearly seen between the panels. Our fill job isn't perfect, but it's adequate. I like to pre-paint parts before assembling them. Mounting them onto sticky side masking tape is a convenient way to keep them from flying away when we spray with our airbrush. Some modelers like to fully complete their model before painting, but I prefer pre-painting. That way I don't have to worry about missing spots or contorting my hand to get paint into difficult to reach places. For this project, our first layer of paint starts with a flat black enamel undercoat. This acts as a quasi-primer and makes imperfections easier to see so we can fix them before applying our base coat. Also, if our subsequent acrylic paint coats get rubbed off or scratched, we see black paint instead of raw plastic. Once the flat black coat is dry, we can inspect our filling work, and it looks like we did a pretty good job. If any gaps remain, we can fix them now before our base coat is applied. For this project, we try something a little different for our track finish. Instead of our usual flat black undercoat, we sprayed on a gloss black enamel instead. I bought this AK Interactive enamel steel paint from the Extreme Metal line some time ago, and I was just itching to try it. The paint sprayed beautifully right out of the bottle, so no thinning was required, and the result was a convincing steel metal finish which looked great. Obviously, this factory fresh finish won't suit our battle-scarred Whippet, so we lightly oversprayed the tracks with a rust-colored enamel. For this project, I used an old bottle of Tester's enamel that I had in my stash. I've never seen any color period photos of the Whippet, and there seems to be some disagreement as to its actual wartime color. Most model box tops and museum displays depict a faded olive green color. Also, from the many photos I've studied of other people's Whippet builds, the green seems to be the preferred color. In his fantastic book on camouflage, author Terence Wise describes the finish the British used pre-World War II as khaki drab. It's also referred to as matte dark earth. These preserved Whippets are finished in this khaki drab color, and that's the tint we're after for our Whippet. We mix Tamiya acrylics XF49 khaki and XF51 khaki drab to achieve our desired base color. We dilute our paint with Tamiya lacquer thinner and spray most of our parts with our khaki drab color. A couple of coats of clear gloss are then applied over the khaki drab. We use Tamiya's clear lacquer gloss thinned with lacquer thinner. Since the running gear is hidden in the final assembly, we'll leave these parts in their flat black finish. We'll also leave the mufflers, tools, and machine guns flat black since we'll be finishing them later. Time to apply our decals. We get a small colorful sheet with markings for 4 vehicles, although there are no instructions on how to apply the German or Russian markings. Tools that come in handy when applying decals include a small soft brush, tweezers, a sharp blade, and a toothpick. We'll also need a shallow plate with a little warm water. Using our sharp blade, we can cut out the decals that we want to apply. These are water slide decals, so we must soak them in water to release them from their paper backing. We kind of slide the decals onto the model, hence the name water slide decal. We position our decals carefully according to the instructions, making sure the numbers and letters are aligned properly. Next, we apply several generous coats of softener over the decal, letting each coat dry in between. Then with a cotton swab dipped in softener, we press the decal down firmly. We can also roll the swab to remove any trapped air bubbles. Once dry, we brush the area gently to remove any stray cotton hairs. We'll be applying a gloss coat and we don't want to seal in any cotton hairs into our finish. Next, we turn our attention to building up our running assembly. Note the raw plastic edges, which help us to get a strong joint when using model glue. The parts and surfaces we see here are hidden by the track, so we can leave some of the parts black. Once all the parts are in place, elastic bands hold everything together while the glue dries. We start by weathering the inside running gear plates before we attach them to the hull. It would be much harder to get at these surfaces if the running gear assemblies were attached to the hull first. We applied streaks already, and here we're pin washing. We'll look at this process in more detail in a moment. And here we're blending the pin wash with a soft large brush. And here's the look we're after. The Whippet has a lot of bolts which lend themselves to pin washing. This gives us that caked on dirt and grime look so common to military vehicles that operate in the field. We left the outside running gear plates unpainted, and the mud chutes, which have already been pre-painted khaki, were masked off so we don't overspray them with our flat black primer coat. As we saw in our build episode, there are these tiny little hooks that get installed as hangers for the towing cable. The hooks are near microscopic and very fragile. If we had attached them earlier, there would be a danger of breaking them off while painting and handling the running gear. We also want raw plastic to glue to when attaching the hooks so the joint is strong. Once the hooks are attached, we repeat the painting process on the outside plates, starting with our flat black undercoat, then our khaki drab, and finally our gloss coat. And let's not forget to paint the red and white strip recognition markings. These were painted on with red and white enamel. These shots reveal the crisp and detailed casting that Meng is renowned for. We start weathering our model by applying streaks. We covered streaking in more detail in other episodes, so we'll time-lapse the process here. We paint stripes and dots of oil color in black, white, and burnt umber in the direction precipitation would run off the vehicle. Then with a wide brush dipped in mineral spirits, we draw the color down the surface. How intense you make the streaking is really a matter of personal preference, but I prefer subtle streaks, so I remove most of the paint. And here's the look we're after. We then repeat the process over the entire model. The The streaking mimics how dirt and grime stain real vehicles when rain and condensation runs off of them. The streaks also break up the flat base color and add a lot of subtle color variety. The streaking also tones down the stark decals. We see the effect in this before and after comparison. Next comes our pin wash. For this project, we use oil paints in a light chocolate brown color. We lighten burnt umber with white to achieve the tone, and we heavily dilute it with mineral spirits so it flows off our brush through capillary action. We apply the pin wash with a very fine brush, touching various raised surfaces like the bolts and rivets, seams, and nooks and crannies, wherever dirt and grime would build up on a real vehicle. Once the oil paint is sufficiently dry, we blend the pin wash with a large soft brush using a light dabbing motion. This removes tide marks and softens the edges of the color. Next, we add a dark raw metal color. We mix oils and burnt umber and black to get the tone. We don't dilute the paint and we brush it onto the edges where likely paint distress would occur. We also darken other areas of the model. We use very little paint, gradually building up the color, and with a large soft brush we dab the paint to soften and blend it into the base color. The dark color replicates worn metal, dirt, grime, and other interesting discolorations, adding depth and variety to the otherwise flat, unimpressive base color. We can also highlight the edges of panels with our soft graphite pencil. We shine up the edges where we applied our raw metal dark color. The pencil marks catch the light and realistically capture the look of raw polished metal. It also gives the model weight as if made of metal rather than styrene. We see here how our blended pin wash and dark patches bring the model's finish to life. In spite of our monochromatic base color, we've achieved a rich blend of colors and tones, creating a realistic field-worn look. Note how the contrasting colors make the little engine covers stand out. On the white hull surfaces, we used a burnt umber pin wash for variety and contrast. We can do a little sponge chipping on the running gear plate since this area would be exposed to battlefield wear. We start by roughening the surface of a sponge ball by tearing little bits off its surface. Then using a very dark gray enamel, we load up our sponge and dab most of the excess paint off. We then gently press the sponge where we want our chips. Practice off the model first, since pressing too hard or applying too much paint can really spoil the effect, not to mention the paint job. We're looking for delicate flakes that are in scale. If done right, the effect looks very realistic. With our chipping done, we can then apply our mud effects. We like to use light sienna, dark mud, and light dust colors and pigment powders. We start by sprinkling and dabbing on our light sienna, building up little piles of the stuff just like real mud collects on vehicles. Then we sprinkle a little dark mud pigment randomly by tapping it off the brush. Next comes a dash of light dust. We then gently blend the powders together to avoid unsightly spots. We then flood the areas with pigment fixer, in this case isopropyl alcohol. It's really important to make sure the brush you apply the fixer with, as well as the fixer itself, is clean and free of pigments and color, otherwise we end up with large unsightly discolored spots that only repainting can remove. And here's the look we're after. Time to assemble and attach our tracks. Assembling the tracks was fast and easy as we saw in our build episode. But attaching the tracks was another matter. There are narrow channels in the back of the track links where the sprocket engages, leaving little room for alignment error. Our tracks or drive sprockets must have been misaligned since we couldn't get the tracks to seat properly around the sprocket. On the real Whippet, the track pads sit a few inches above the side plate, giving the impression that the track pads are floating. If installed properly, the tracks totally hide all the wheels. Knowing this, we ended up cutting all the teeth off the sprocket wheels, followed by a gentle filing to thin the sprocket wheels. And this takes us to the second challenge. There are lengths where the tracks are unsupported, which causes the tracks to sag. To maintain the small space between the pads and plate, we added styrene sheet to support the tracks in these two areas. No supports were installed on the bottom, so we had to fiddle with the tracks until they sat properly. Then thin CA was flooded onto the track joints to maintain the shape. Although the butchery was likely model building sacrilege, once assembled, our surgery goes completely unseen. For tow cables, some boxings of this kit include a length of string, but our kit packed is braided metal wire. The instructions call for the cable to be hung on the outside of the running gear plate. Because the metal wire is fairly stiff and springy and the hanger hooks are extremely fragile, getting the cables attached was an adventure. Thankfully, we get extra hanger hooks in the box since I broke off and lost 2 of them when installing the cable. Using string instead of wire for the towing cables would have made installation much easier. To attach the cables, we use thin CA glue, and we also use these micro brushes to apply the glue. We pour out a little puddle of the CA and pick some of it up with our micro brush. Then, as we illustrated here in our Stug 3 build, we hold the cable in place with tape, tweezers, or a toothpick, and we flood the area with CA. The thin CA flows off our brush through capillary action. The glue takes only a few seconds to set up. The CA dries shiny, so we'll have to touch up the areas with dull coat or with weathering. Once our running gear assemblies are completed, we can attach them to the vehicle and add mud to our tracks. The fixer darkens the pigments, but as it dries, it does lighten up again, as we see here. And here's the finished look. To finish the machine gun ball mounts, we use our soft graphite pencil. We simply color over the flat black enamel paint that we applied earlier. We press hard with the pencil to burnish the graphite on. For the machine guns, we can also use this gunmetal pigment powder. We apply the powder with these inexpensive makeup applicators. The applicators have fairly stiff rubbery ends, which are ideal for rubbing the powder on. We can enhance the shine with our pencil. It's a good idea to glue the guns to their ball mounts since we don't want to accidentally drop them into the fighting compartment. We then insert the gun and ball mount into its respective hole. Next, the flange gets installed to hold the ball in place. CA glue is then flooded on the flange's edges. If we're careful when gluing the flanges on, our machine gun should swivel freely in their ball mounts, just like in the real Whippet. Once installed, the guns look awesome. To finish the mufflers, we use these rust-colored pigment powders. We simply dry rub the pigments over our black base coat. To finish the grousers, we start by painting the wood parts with a light wood buff color. We use the little wood color enamel lightened with white. Next, we paint wood grain on with a thin brush using brown or rust enamel paint. We then paint over the wood areas with a clear orange acrylic. We finish by pin washing the metal bolts and dabbing a little burnt umber oil on the edges of the wood parts. And then we can attach the grousers with thin CA glue. Although the Meng Whippet looks simple, almost primitive, its form belies the relative high part count and tricky buildups. The many wheels, track links, and grousers require considerable time investment for cleanup and installation. The kit's faceted superstructure buildup, the fidgety tow cable attachment, and its no room for error track installation require the experience, skill, and patience of intermediate to advanced modeling skills. Still, with a little perseverance and patience, the kit builds up into a fine representation of the British Whippet. A perfect project for the experienced modeler with an interest in war history and the origins of armored warfare. And that'll do it for this episode. Check back soon for more unboxings, builds, and painting and weathering episodes. And a special thanks goes out to all our subscribers who make this channel possible. Leave us a like, dislike, subscribe, or just ravage us in the comments. Or stop by the channel Tom's World for a neighborly visit and for a complete list of all our videos. In the meantime, keep your canteens full and your uniform tidy, stay well, and all the best.